Hi, everyone. I want to make sure that everyone can hear me broadcasting. So if you can hear sound right now and you can see our video, please go ahead and let us know in the chat so that we know that things are working. Excellent. Jeffrey, thanks so much. Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so I want to welcome everyone to this first in a series of our Stylist Author webinars. I'm Dr. Katie Linder. I'm a stylist author myself and also host of You've Got This podcast, which is going to be co-sponsoring this webinar series. And I'm thrilled today to bring you another stylist author, Joan Middendorf. First, though, we would love to know where everyone is coming from today. So if you can tell us in the chat where you are logged in from, so we know all the different parts of the country or the world that we have people joining us from, that would be great. All right. People are coming from Portland, Oregon, Illinois, New York, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Jordan, Europe, Lithuania, Rhode Island, North Carolina, Boston, St. Louis, Ontario. Great. We have an international audience coming in today. This is amazing. Missouri, Indiana, Texas. So fun to see you all here. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm also curious if anyone in the room is in a group where you are watching the webinar with a group of people, maybe in a Center for Teaching and Learning or with some other group. So if that is true, please also let us know because we'd love to get a sense if there are some groups watching us as well. So let us know in the chat if that is the case.
I'm going to talk in a minute. Don't worry.
Yes, Joan's coming up, I promise. She's coming up. All right, now I'd like to officially introduce our guest today, Joan Middendorf, who is the lead instructional consultant in the Center for Innovative Teaching and Learning and an adjunct professor in educational leadership at Indiana University. She is also the author of Overcoming Student Learning Bottlenecks, which is going to be the book that we're talking about today. There is also probably a call to action button on your screen if you want to learn more about the book. That should take you to the Stylist webpage where you can learn a little bit more about that. I can also drop the link later on into the chat as well. But what we are going to do today is I have some questions already prepared for Joan, but we would love to have your questions as well. And so there is also a feature of this webinar platform where you can ask a question. So you want to look for the Ask a Question button. It's also something that is, there should be a plus sign next to the chat feature as well, where you can click on that and ask a question. And that alerts me specifically to the question that you want to ask Joan. So I'm going to be keeping an eye on that Ask a Question feature to see if we have any questions come through. And at any time in the webinar, please feel free to ask a question or a follow-up question, and I'll make sure that that gets to Joan. And I will be also just checking in with you a couple of times throughout the webinar as well about any questions that you might have for Joan today. So Joan, thank you so much for joining me. If you want to say hi to folks who are here, give a brief introduction.
Hello to everybody here and all over the world. So great to be with you all. I see so many friends in the chat. It's really heartwarming. Thanks.
All right. So to kick us off, I thought I would just ask Joan, what are student learning bottlenecks? This is the main topic of the book, but can you give us a definition? What are these student learning bottlenecks?
Okay, bottlenecks are the places where students get stuck, even when the teacher is really doing their best to teach and the students are still getting stuck. And you want to think about it as being like a signal that's coming from the students. Just like right now, the Earth is giving us signals that the planet is warming, and we have to pay attention to those signals. Some places are getting too much rain, some places are getting hotter than they should be, and we get signals from our students. And so the signal is, instead of being annoying or bothersome, instead of bashing the students for it, the signal, we want to think of it as a flag that's telling us that the students are struggling to do the kind of thinking that the professor is doing right then. That is, the expert is doing some kind of thinking that's very difficult, that they might not realize how difficult it is, and the students don't know how to do it. So the bottleneck itself is a theory of difficult, to start noticing what is this place that's a hurdle that the students are having a hard time getting over it. So we can think about what are the characteristics of that hurdle, and that's the bottleneck Some examples of bottlenecks are if you're teaching a course where you're teaching a writing well, students might not know as they go from course to course, they might be required to do different kinds of writing. So they might just think they have to use the same kind of writing across courses. Or in a statistics course, students might find it difficult to know when to use the different statistical procedures. In a geology class, when students have to think across vast timelines, that's really hard. People can think in human terms, but when it gets out of like maybe a couple thousand years, when you're talking about hundreds of millions of years, students don't really know what that's like for them. You know, if you sat and watched water drip on a rock for your lifetime, you might not ever see a change. So geologists have to sort of speed up time, like time-lapse photography, and students don't know that. Lots of fields have that you have to generate ideas. You have to generate hypotheses in the sciences, in biology, for example. You know, and in fields like history, you have to generate arguments. And so students might think in those fields they just have to memorize, and that's a bottleneck, that they don't know actually sort of what is the enterprise of the field. But besides the book being about bottlenecks, and that's theories of difficulty, we also want to talk about the overcoming, because a big part of the book is about overcoming the bottlenecks. Okay. So.
All right. We're going to get to that in just a little bit. I know Joan is going to walk us through all the different steps. I want to connect this, though, Joan, to a concept called decoding the disciplines, which I think this is related to, and it might be something that folks in the audience have heard of. Can you tell us a little bit about that, Joan? What's decoding the disciplines and how is it related to this?
Yeah, so this is the overcoming part of the bottlenecks. Decoding the disciplines is a theory of pedagogy. So theories of pedagogy, theories of difficulty tell us, here's the problem, here's the thing that's blocking the learning. Theories of pedagogy tell us about the teaching and learning process and how to get students through the bottleneck. So once we see where the gap is, our theory says we want to unpack the implicit knowledge of the expert, no small task, and make it explicit. And then the rest of our model after that second step is to show students what the research from cognitive science says you can do to help students learn what that mental move is. So it's a different way of thinking about teaching. It's not often when people think about their teaching, they think about the examples they're going to teach to. But the research says students don't really know what to pay attention to in the example. I like to think about if I was going to teach everybody who's here today, say, how to waltz. Instead of thinking about, I wonder what music I should play to teach everybody the waltz. Instead, I would really like to teach you, I would like to break down the process of doing a waltz. How do you teach people to turn really fast? How do you teach two dance partners to stay together when they're turning? How do you teach people to stay on the beat, or how to go a little before or after the beat? And so that no matter what waltz music came up, I would be able to know the moves to make with that dance. And it's the same with our content. If you teach people your mental moves, no matter what content you would give them, they would know how to do that move. So once you unpack the mental move of the expert, then you know their mental process. You know their mental assumptions, and the mental action is what we call it. And this book is about the mental, what do you do then once you can get the mental action? Also, to me these days, when people talk about student learning outcomes, I often find that student learning outcomes can be kind of vague and kind of use education jargon. But once you know the mental action, then you can get really clear about, it is the student learning outcome. It is a very clear student learning outcome, such as, here's some examples of mental actions. In a class, when you want students to give peer feedback on the writing, then the mental action is take the reader perspective. That's kind of the overall. Then there's some other parts to it. Often the bottleneck will have, the mental action will have some subparts. So besides taking the reader perspective, kind of what does that mean? You might say, talk about the larger matters instead of like punctuation is going to be more helpful if you're giving feedback to somebody on their writing. And don't take control of the text. If you're taking the reader perspective, if somebody's writing this way and then you sort of make them go that way, that's not really taking the reader perspective. Maybe give people some encouragement, and then based on what the writing task is, You might encourage the author some way to do more than they've done, like push the boundaries on maybe giving more dialogue or something like that. It kind of depends on what the writing task is. But anyway, that's just one mental action, which is taking the reader perspective. Another one, computing. One mental action is recursion. That is writing a program, a computer program that infinitely repeats itself until you tell it to stop. And that's really hard for students to think about, a program that's going to just keep going. So geology, geologists have to imagine the physical and chemical laws about what happened at a given location over in the distant past and in the distant future, what is going to happen. So those are some mental actions. And it will really guide your teaching if you can be clear about what the mental action is. Okay, so decoding the disciplines is a theory about if you can notice where students have difficulty, unpack the expert thinking, then the rest of the teaching is pretty clear, I think you can be a really knockout teacher if you do those two things.
All right. So Joan, I'm curious. It sounds like understanding where students might be having difficulty if you're an expert could be kind of challenging. So this seems like one of those models where you would be communicating with your students pretty frequently to try to figure out what are the components that might be causing them difficulty or might be causing them bottlenecks. And I know we're going to get into some steps about identifying this later on, but I'm wondering if you can speak to that just briefly about how does this maybe impact how you communicate with your students in the classroom day to day to make sure that they're telling you if things aren't working well for them or if they're not really understanding something.
My overall goal for people to use this process is to think about teaching in a new way instead of thinking about the content that you want to teach or the examples you're going to choose or thinking about the teaching method you're going to use. To me, to put the horse before the cart, you're going to think about the bottleneck viewpoint. Where do the students struggle, which tells me what to prioritize in the class. And then what kind of thinking does that take? And then constantly assess, can students do those kinds of thinking, the ones that I prioritize because they struggle with. So it has a real important feedback loop. But once you know what the thinking is and you're assessing to it, and that's a different kind of grading, a different kind of assessment than assessment for grading. It's small checks. Can the students do this? Do I need to do something more so they can get it? We use a lot of classroom assessment techniques for this kind of assessment, but it's really about getting a feedback loop and getting the student view of learning.
All right, so we have a question coming in from Jeffrey who says, how is this different than disciplinary literacy?
I don't know that particular term, but disciplines are a really important part of decoding the disciplines. Disciplines are at the heart of teaching and learning because disciplines have different ways of creating knowledge and they have different ways of solving problems and they present different kinds of problems for the learner. They present different disciplines to present different challenges to learners, to the learners. So we want to be really clear. I would love to see every field develop really clearly what is the epistemology of the field. What are the ways that knowledge is created? How do we put that into words? Not what's the results of our research, but what kind of thinking does this take? And that's what we're trying to do bit by bit with this approach.
So it does sound, I think that what Jeffrey's referring to, it sounds like there's a lot of overlap between disciplinary literacy and what you're describing here, Joan. So you had mentioned kind of having this increased communication with your students, checking in with them, seeing how things are going. I'm also wondering if this kind of approach necessitates increased communication with your disciplinary colleagues to have a better understanding from them about where they're seeing student bottlenecks, maybe in courses that come before yours or after yours, Or if you are, do you see kind of increased communication happening within departments to try to also kind of figure out how this might work?
It helps departments in their culture to get some language for talking about what they're trying to teach, to be able to point to the bottlenecks and to be able to point to what are the biggest bottlenecks. And you can use it for curriculum design. So you can say, you know, what are the main bottlenecks in our field and what kind of mental actions do those take? And then you get your student learning outcomes. So yeah, we find that especially when you get more, you can do it in your, like in a department by yourself and talk to people in other departments so in one thing, you can talk to people in other fields just in your school that aren't in your department, but it can help if you get a core of, you know, group of people in your department who are using the same language.
Excellent. All right, so we have more questions coming in, Joan. One is asking, how do you deal with multiple ways and modes of student thinking? So do you have a sense of how maybe to answer this, or do you need more information?
Are you asking, is this about learning styles?
That's a good question. Let's see. Esther, if you want to clarify. Yes. Esther says yes.
Well, I'm sorry to say that I would like to point to some literature on learning styles that says that learning styles is a debunked theory. And so if we want students to learn where Zaire is in Africa, we really want them to look at a map. And I don't care if they're an oral learner or if they, you know, it's really something they need to look at or at least feel on a map outline where Zaire is. And if I'm teaching somebody about listening to music, I don't care if they're a visual learner. They need to hear the music. And so what's really more important is what are the habits of minds that we're trying to develop? And the research has pretty much shown that if you can show students the habit of minds they need to develop, then they will, that's what you need them to practice. That's what you need to model. That's what they need to try. And the idea that you should teach to a certain style, that just has not, they've done a lot of research and it doesn't show that that helps students in learning. So you can go read about learning styles being debunked if you're interested.
Yeah, this is something that's come up a lot recently, and the way that I've heard it described more is less about learning styles and more about learning preferences. So we all might have certain ways that we prefer to learn, but it definitely doesn't mean that we can only learn in those ways. So particularly for disciplinary ways of knowing, maybe there are certain ways that are kind of required by the discipline if it's very text heavy or very visually oriented and that students would need to adjust to.
Yeah.
Okay, we have another question here from, let's see. Bonnie is asking, what if we refer to learning preferences as starting points to build their learning base? So kind of starting with something where they're familiar or comfortable, Bonnie, is that kind of where you're thinking? Yeah, she's also referenced learning preferences rather than styles. Do you have any thoughts on that, Joan?
Well, one of the first things we want to do whenever I'm starting with any group is to find out what are people thinking. People come to a topic you're teaching and they already have ideas about it. So I think it's even right at the start, even though in our model, step 6 is assessment. And if we get a chance, Katie, I'd like to go through the steps of the model.
Yes, we definitely will. Mm-hmm.
Okay. But I think we can right away try to assess what are the ideas that people are already giving themselves a story about what this learning is going to be about. And that can help you find out where they're already liking something or this is why they're interested. So you want to bring up these things that they're interested. You might have some more emphasis on certain kinds of the kinds of examples you bring to the class. You're still going to use the same mental process. You're still going to have to practice the same way, but there might be some things, you know, it's not that you're not ever paying attention to student interest, but it's really important to be checking in with the students and adjusting to them.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. All right, we have one more question kind of related to this, and then we'll shift back into the questions I had for you, Joan. Jeffrey says, experts can suffer from the curse of knowledge. I'm curious how experts assess newcomers. So it sounds like you were kind of headed in that direction a little bit, thinking about how novices can be assessed in particular areas. And maybe this is something that's tied in with your 7-step process. So if it is, maybe we can wait and answer it later on. But do you have any initial thoughts now?
Well, I don't know. I'm not really clear how experts assess novices. I mean, experts have a big blind spot. And so it's hard for them to know what is hard for the novice, and hard for them to break things down at the difficult spots because it's something that they haven't struggled with. And so we want to use a lot of small assessments so we can try to see what the students tell us about what they're finding difficult. And then we can help bridge that gap between what we already think is obvious. I did a decoding interview today, and somebody, when they were done, said, wow, I thought all those things were so obvious, but they aren't to the novice.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Okay. So Joan, before we shift into your 7-step process, I'm really curious for you to share with us how you came to be interested in student learning bottlenecks. I love origin stories of books. It's one of my favorite things to hear about. So I would love to hear how you came to be interested in this topic and what led to you writing the book in the first place. Yeah.
Well, in 1996, I got invited by the dean of faculty from our campus to go to a week-long leadership workshop led by Pat Hutchings, where we were supposed to make a project about teaching and bring it back to our campus. And I went with David Pace, and we came back and we said we were going to help just connect people teaching large gateway courses with the literature on teaching and learning so they could do that better. And we were able to start leading these workshops, summer seminars. And that was okay. There was a lot of ideas out there, but really there was a gap in the theory. But in that same year, in the fall, I went to the POD conference, and a Black psychologist, James Anderson, brought up the idea of bottlenecks, which was great. I mean, the next year we put that in our workshop, our seminar, and that made it a lot better. The people could tell where their students got stuck. But if you knew David and I, we weren't going to leave people stuck at the bottleneck because it was just a theory of difficulty, the bottleneck. And so we pretty soon developed a process for interviewing experts about what they do so they don't get stuck. And after we had the interview method, lots of other methods got developed. Swancha Lam from Bielefeld University came to us and said at her writing program, she had developed a self-interrogation writing process for writing and reflecting on the bottlenecks and the expert thinking. And Sue Hines at St. Mary's University in Minneapolis, she told me about a method she'd made up for having experts use Play-Doh to uncover the mental moves in their mind. To me, decoding, uncovering the expert knowledge is like you're in the person's head and you're in their tacit knowledge area, and it's a dark room with the lights turned out, and you're trying to turn on the light. You're trying to find the light switches in the dark. So you've got to ask them a lot of questions. So how do you do it? What do you do? What do you do next? What do you do next? And you take some guesses at it, and then you can help them uncover their tacit knowledge. And so we're using a lot of methods, mind mapping, analogies, rubrics, but decoding rubrics that start with where are the places students get stuck and what do you do to avoid them. That helps you get people through so you can get the mental actions out from the person's head, their mental process, onto the table, and then we can teach it to the students.
It sounds like this has a lot of connection to metacognition, or the idea of helping students to see how they're learning so that they can articulate where things are breaking down for them, where they have questions, where they're confused. Is that a connection that makes sense to make? I'm sorry,
you told me not to look at the chat, and I just did. Hi, Laura Cruz. She and I are working on a project together. We're going to try to work on decoding online teaching, working on the bottlenecks to online teaching. So that was distracting when I saw her. I'm sorry, will you ask your question again, please?
It's okay.
All my friends.
To clarify, I told Joan not to worry about the chat because it can be a little bit distracting.
Yes.
Okay, so Joan, what I had asked was, how is this connected, or do you see this connected to the concept of metacognition, or helping students to see how they learn?
Absolutely. It's really important to not just teach them the content, but teach them to stand above it and to learn strategically what are the moves that the learner should be making? What are the moves that the expert makes? And a lot of the assessment is to get students to go metacognitive on their learning.
All right, excellent. We also have a great comment in the chat from Erica, who says that she uses her Center for Teaching and Learning, a midterm feedback option. And this is definitely a great way to learn about bottlenecks in the classroom, to get someone else to come in and talk with your students to see how things are going. So that's an excellent suggestion, Erica. Thanks for raising it.
I use that too.
Awesome. Yeah, no, this is great. Thanks so much for the back channel here. This is really great to hear what people are doing. Okay, so before we get into the 7-step process for overcoming bottlenecks, we wanted to pause now that everybody knows what bottlenecks are and see if we could get some examples from the audience of bottlenecks that you might find in your own discipline, so that we can kind of crowdsource some ideas from you all and get some really concrete examples. So we would love for you to write in the chat, what are your bottlenecks? Where is a place where students struggle in your course or a course that you're helping to work on, even when the teacher is working hard, maybe doing a good job, but students just consistently seem to struggle in a particular area? So I will start with one example, and then I see a bunch coming in here. In my background, women and gender studies, students always seem to struggle with the concept of intersectionality, which is that you have multiple identities that are kind of interacting with each other at one time. And they struggle with that, and also with the concept of identities being socially constructed. So that's a big one. Some other ones I see coming in here: known misconceptions in physics. Let's see.
There's a lot of them. Physics is really tough.
Understanding using learning objectives from the faculty perspective. Yes. Scientific notation on a calculator. Let's see, heat versus energy transfer in chemical engineering. We have such a great range of disciplines here. In teaching German, students struggle with the concepts of grammar. Let's see, in narrative literacy, students struggle with writing literary analysis, being able to analyze specific quotes or scenes from novels. Let's see.
Probability in computer engineering, probability in a lot of fields, probabilities in biology, it's in a lot of fields.
Absolutely. History constructed by historians as a bottleneck.
Yes.
Let's see. Yes. Statistics and everything. Okay. So really good examples here. Yes, I see lots of people agreeing with the stats piece as well. All right. Joan, do you want to comment on any of that before we get into the 7-step process?
No, those are lots of good bottlenecks. Some bottlenecks are bigger than others. So, saying statistics is big. And then some are more specific, like intersectionality in gender studies and the multiple identities. And usually when we work on a bottleneck, we find that the first bottleneck we work on is really big, and then it might have 5 parts to it. And so you have to dig into one part of the bottleneck and tackle that. And then once you get that sort of really under, so you can get students really getting it very well, you take the next part and work on it.
Okay.
And so, I see Sandra Cristolini saying in pedagogy, students have problems to connect theory to practice. It's really hard for students. A lot of fields use they use models and theories, and then they expect people to do something with that in the real world. But they're not really teaching students how to take the theory, turn it into a model, put it on real people, and then, I don't know, adjust the model or change the way you're applying it. Those are several steps of thinking that are very challenging that we see in a lot of fields, sociology, education for 2.
Okay, so we have several questions that have come in, Joan. So I'm sorry to put off the 7 steps, but let's answer a few questions first.
Yay for questions.
Okay, so we have someone who came in a little bit late and said, is there a difference between bottlenecks and threshold concepts?
Excellent question. I'm so glad you've asked that one, because I am actually working with Leah Shopko, my wonderful co-author on this book, and I want to be sure and give a shout out to Leah Shopko. She's just a fantastic profession and such a great person to work with on this project. We're writing an article right now for a book that's going to come out about threshold concepts. So threshold concepts and bottlenecks are both theories of difficulty, right? They're both looking at where is the place that students get stuck. The threshold concept is kind of a metaphor for this space that you want students to go through, and the teacher's kind of watching the student go through it. The bottleneck is more like a traffic jam of ideas that we're trying to get the students through. To me, the threshold concept is, so there's many kinds of bottlenecks, and the threshold concept is one. To me, it's a paradigm shifting bottleneck, the way they describe it, that once you go through it, you don't go back. And I think intersectionality, for example, is a threshold concept. It's a paradigm shifting bottleneck. I think decoding the disciplines is a paradigm shifting, threshold concept. But there's some bottlenecks that are just kind of like a skill or a habit of mind. Like if you want students to learn writing as a process, and you want them to learn that you don't just write something one time, but you do multiple drafts over time and you get feedback on it, it's not really a threshold concept. It's not like a paradigm shifting idea. It's just a new habit that somebody needs to teach them, and somebody needs to enforce that they do it and then get them in the habit of doing it. There's other kinds of bottlenecks. There's the persistent science misconceptions. There's like 30 years worth of research on persistent science misconceptions, which can be intuitive or received concepts that block the way the expert thinks. The new idea, this old concept is in the head, and the new idea can't come in because that other previous concept is there. And so that's a misconception. There's emotional bottlenecks. People's worldview, like I think recent Earth creationism versus evolution, where you want students, instead of using a religious idea or a received idea, an idea received from somebody else, to think about evolution, you might want people to use isotopic analysis or use fossil record, use the scientific tools that we have to think about how long things have been going on Earth. So the comparative ideas, you're right to ask about threshold concepts and bottlenecks. Those are both two theories of difficulty, but our book is about overcoming the threshold concept, overcoming the bottleneck, and it is decoding the disciplines is a theory of pedagogy to get people through the threshold concept. I just wanted you to know that Laura Cruz and I will be presenting the Threshold Concepts Conference is coming to the US for the first time. It's their 7th conference. It's going to be in Oxford, Ohio, around like the 12th of June, I think it starts. And on the first day at a pre-conference session, there'll be a session about what are threshold concepts. And opposite that session will be me and Laura Cruz, and maybe Leah Shopko, I'm not sure, doing a session on how do you decode a threshold concept. It's called like bring your favorite threshold concept and we'll decode it. Okay.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. All right, so we have a couple different questions here. I think we're going to get to one of them when we get to the steps. So I'm going to wait on that one. Jeffrey asks, are bottlenecks to be avoided or leveraged?
Yeah, bottlenecks are a gift that where the students get stuck, the signal that you get from them is a gift that the students are giving you every day, because your expertise kind of blocks you from seeing where they struggle. When you can start seeing things as bottlenecks and valuing that you're getting a signal that the students need help at a certain point, I think you want to prioritize them in your class and spend more time on them instead of marching same amount of time on every topic in your class. Prioritize. You can teach to the bottlenecks. In fact, we've been writing about, instead of backward course design, forward design. In forward design, you take the main bottlenecks in a course, like the main bottlenecks, say, in a gender studies course would be gender and feminist praxis and intersectionality, and give me one or two more, and you could design and make a really great course. If you could help students learn those things, that would be a powerful gender studies course, where you would just really do lessons and build your course around those really hard, the bottlenecks.
All right, so it sounds like we're trying to leverage them. Excellent answer. Okay, and then let's grab one more question before we get into the 7-step process here, Joan. So somebody has said they often use the term bottlenecks with faculty to help them identify them. but find that sometimes it's they need to clarify that word with other terms or examples. They're wondering if you have other terms or ways to describe bottlenecks to help faculty understand it clearly.
Huh. Yeah, because people do have to learn. It is kind of a technical term, getting to be a term about it. So, I mean, the place that students struggle, the place that over and over again you're teaching well and the students can't get it. So something about a place students struggle, a place students seem stuck. And also, I often say that it's a place where the teacher is frustrated. Like, you know, you might have in a course, when you think about it, several places where the students get stuck. And what are the ones that bother you the most? The ones that bother you the most, those are the ones you could really do a lot with and probably are really worth working on.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so there's a couple more questions here, Joan, but I think we've held everyone off from the 7-step process for long enough. So let's talk about the 7-step process you have for overcoming bottlenecks. And this is actually the 7 steps that are on the cover of the book. There's this 7-step cycle. So if you want to look at the cover, you can see it there. But why don't you just briefly give us a description of these steps, Joan?
Okay, and you can go to our website, decodingthedisciplines.org, just decoding the disciplines all one word, and you could see that graphic right there on that website too if you want to see the steps. And I do want to say that this is not a linear process. You can jump in at any one of these steps. They're all based on cognitive science and research on the scholarship of teaching and learning, and they'll be useful. Although most of the time, we do want to find the bottleneck and uncover what is the expert's assumptions and mental moves. And then everything else gets driven by what kind of thinking we're trying to develop. So the first step is identify the bottlenecks. The second is decode the expert's mental process. And now all the rest of the steps are about how to teach it. Well, most of them are. So the third one is model. Once you find out that mental action, a mental move you want students to make, you want to model it for students. You do that with analogies. And then examples where you highlight where the mental action is taking place. And then you want students now you've shown them you doing it. Now they need to practice it. Step 4 is for them to practice it and get feedback. And sometimes parts have to be broken out for them to practice it. Step 5 is how do you motivate and hold students to do this new kind of what might be very hard? How do you get them to persist on this new mental move that you want them to do, which they might not be used to doing this new mental move? And step 6 is then to assess their performance. Is there something that they need to do more of? How much are they getting it? And do you need to go back some? Is there some other part that they're not getting? So assessment, really big. And then finally, the last step, it's really not so much about teaching, but sharing with others. It helps you consolidate what you've learned from this process if you can go back over and reflect on what you've been getting out of it. So you could identify a bottleneck and figure out what kind of thinking it is, and then just jump right to a teacher who tells you, I'd really like to work on active learning in my class. So you can just, okay, well, where students, where do we work on it? Where's a place in your course where students get stuck? And let's figure out what kind of thinking it takes. Okay, now we can see now that we know what kind of thinking it takes, we can work on what teaching methods to use, what kind of practice. Or maybe somebody says, I need help with my lecturing. So you can say, okay, let's pick a class that's coming up that students really, really struggle with. We'll find a bottleneck. What kind of thinking do you do? And then we'll show them how to use analogies to make a powerful lecture. So you can just jump to the part you need. Maybe a program wants to have their professors learn assessment. So you can help them think about where are students struggling, what kind of thinking to say, okay, how do we assess it? You have to go through all the steps.
Okay, so we've had a question come in about step number 1, defining a bottleneck. Someone says, how do you parse a troublesome knowledge area, as you said in the beginning, a place where students get stuck, down to a specific bottleneck? So how might you really narrow in and figure out what's going on there?
Yeah, so usually, here's the difference between threshold concepts and bottlenecks. I think the threshold concepts people have really contributed to the field because they've spent so much time defining the nature of this place that's making a hurdle for students to learn. And we just kind of just give us the general bottleneck. We don't have to be that particular, but we're really particular about uncovering what kind of thinking it takes. But the whole first chapter is about how do you either, if you've taught before, most people who've taught before can tell you a bottleneck or more than one bottleneck in their class. If you haven't taught before, how you can approach colleagues to ask them to help you come up with a bottleneck, how you can do literature searches, doing things like looking up misconceptions, threshold concepts in your field, or, so there's different techniques for finding the bottleneck. But it's okay. I find most people just grab a bottleneck, start working on it. Once you start decoding it, you might find, wait, I've got 5 bottlenecks on my hand, or the first time you assess it, wait, there's actually 2 things going on here. That's okay. You can change your bottleneck at any time. It's just really great. All of the things we're doing with teaching and learning make sense when you're operating from what kind of mental move are we trying to teach?
Okay, so we've had another question come in that says, some bottlenecks may be more related to general study skills and attitudes. For example, the time it takes to learn may be underestimated by students. Does this count as a bottleneck?
Yes, that counts as a bottleneck. One time somebody in our class wanted to teach students in his class, they didn't know how to take notes in his field. I think the bottlenecks that are most useful are the ones that are closer to the middle of your epistemology of your field, closer to the main ways meaning is made in your field. So sometimes people like to work on the bottleneck of students don't use the right form of citation. And I think citation is really meant to help students understand how the conversations are set up in a field, so you can track back the conversation in fields that are all about the conversation going on in the literature. But I mean, it might be more important, for example, in history, to help students learn how to analyze a source, the questions that historians bring to sources. They do kind of have a heuristic for asking questions of a source, and getting students to generate interpretations once they've read several sources. Then how do they explain what those sources mean? Those seem, so I just think it's more worth your time, the more central to the meaning making in your discipline the bottleneck is. But you still get something out of it if you work on the other kind.
Okay. We have another step-specific question for step number 3 on modeling tasks.
Yeah.
This person asked, for step 3, how many models would you suggest? I worry that providing only 1 or 2 models makes students feel they have to mimic specific models. Creating multiple models, though, takes quite a bit of time.
I'm not saying create a model. I'm using the term model like show. So I want to show students the mental process I use, and I'm going to use an analogy. So the analogy will show them exactly what mental muscle I would use. Like an analogy for time, the large time scales in geology is time-lapse photography, where you just cut out large parts of time and just are jumping over huge amounts of details in time to drop in and look at certain points. So I'm using an analogy to show students exactly the mental move that I'm using, but in a different field. And then I'm giving an example from my field. And then pretty soon I want them to try it. And if they're not getting it, I might bring in another example. Okay, so I'm showing them how to do it. It depends, if I want students to learn how to analyze primary sources, I might have to show them, depends on how many kinds of sources there are in your field. If there's, lots of visual sources and lots of written sources, that might be several examples to show. It might be what I'm trying to teach is the basis for the whole course, and I'm going to spend 3 weeks on it. Depends on how important this bottleneck is.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so we have another question. The 7-step model is rather involved. Are there any shortcuts? Seems to take a long time and much effort to move students through this.
Yes, there is a shortcut. The secret sauce is, I think when I only have 5 minutes to do decoding with somebody and I get them to tell me a bottleneck, then the really secret power is I start playing step 3 analogy game with them. So I'll say, okay, you just said, intersectionality is a really hard bottleneck in your field, Katie. So I want to think of, and I'm going to just throw, so to me, intersectionality, which is you said having multiple identities. It's like, where do I have multiple identities? Is it like wearing different hats? Is that a good analogy? And she's going to find out. She'll right away try that on. She'll think, oh, here's what's wrong with that analogy. And she's going to critique that analogy for me. And we're already decoding what is the mental move that she uses. And she's going to come out with, maybe she's going to offer me, try it, Katie. She might offer me a different analogy or tell me what's wrong with that analogy. What if I say intersectionality? If I was going to use an analogy for intersectionality, is it like, wearing different hats?
Well, I guess I could say no, because you typically don't wear multiple hats at the same time.
Wait a second.
But the other
You're
analogy,
breaking up a little. Can you go over that?
You don't typically wear multiple hats at the same time. Like you wouldn't stack them one on top of each other.
Yeah.
So that might not be the best analogy.
Okay. So she just told us something about this kind of thinking where you have multiple identities. They can be additive. You can be doing many of them at the same time, or some of them at the same time. I don't know how many. Okay. So we're already doing so that's the shortcut to figuring out what kind of mental moves somebody makes. How about, let me just throw one more analogy at Katie. What if I say it's like, have a very simple recipe. Some people might have few identities, like chocolate chip cookies that have flour, sugar, butter, vanilla, chocolate chips, versus somebody who likes to make chocolate chip cookies where they're throwing in some herbs, they're having nuts, they're having 2 kinds of chips, they're having, I don't know, just lots, like twice as many ingredients. Is it like having a recipe with a lot of ingredients in it?
It could be similar to that, except it may not be that there are more complicated recipes than others, because most people have identities. They may not be as affected by them as other folks, but they have them. So,
okay.
But the recipes could be different from one another. So we're getting closer.
Okay, so we could keep going with this, but in a few minutes, we could she's explaining the mental move to think about multiple identities. And it's very helpful. We're understanding that people have more than one identity and there can be different recipes.
Excellent.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
So there's the shortcut to decoding. And people might think, I don't know how to make analogies. I mean, I just jumped into some. I didn't think I used to be good at analogies, but I have learned how to just pull back and say multiple identities. Where have I seen a lot of having different identities? I mean, I was thinking costumes and then I thought hats, so I just threw one out there, a bad one, and boom, she reacted and you could see it started working. Then you can show one, even if it's half-baked, to the students. And when they're all done with the lesson and they've pretty much gotten it, ask them to come up with an analogy and they might come up with a great one. You can steal it.
Excellent. Okay, so before I return to my questions, Joan, we've got one more here, and we're nearing kind of the end of our hour together. So if there's additional questions, definitely we want to put them into the Ask a Question section. So I want to just remind folks that you can keep asking questions. So this person says, are you familiar with Fisher's skill theory on micro development and applying that to conceptual thinking and learning increasingly more complex concepts? This would mean that there are sequences of bottlenecks that must be overcome to attain an expert understanding. How would you move students through those levels?
Okay, I'm sorry. You're going to have to read the first half of the question again because you kind of went in and out.
Okay, it's Fisher's skill theory on micro development.
Fisher's what?
Fisher's skill theory. And I think the general idea here is, can you have like multiple bottlenecks that kind of are related to one another, where you unlock one and then another one shows up? Like there's a sequence that students need to move through to learn.
I haven't really heard of that. If somebody wants to put something in the comments about it, and I couldn't really hear you because you kept going in and out. So I'm feeling like I don't want to try to answer something that I don't really understand the question and I haven't heard it. But so I would say that there are, some things we're teaching, there's different kinds of knowledge. Some things are procedural, and then there's like a big procedure and then there's subparts to the procedure. Some kinds of knowledge are, people have some pre-concepts come in before you get to the particular bottleneck you're interested in. And it just most often we find that something that seems like a relatively simple bottleneck is often a very big bottleneck that has many parts to it that are small.
All right. So our last question here for now. It sounds like analogies for mental movements are pretty central to your modeling of mental action.
I just think it's central to good teaching. And I think people haven't emphasized it very much, but work coming out of cognitive science says that analogies are very important to show students how to take something they already know how to do and use it in this context. And it kind of strips away all the rest of the things going on in the same discipline so they know where to put their focus.
All right, so we've had that question posted in the chat if you want to look at it, Joan,
okay,
just so you
you.
can see it.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not familiar with Fisher's skill theory on microdevelopment. But I do say that I think scaffolding is really important. And I do think that there are sequences of bottlenecks, and I do like to use it in curriculum development. And I think it's really important to see which things are building on something else. Thank you.
Okay.
For putting the question where I could see it. It's like, what's that?
All right. So, Joan, I'm curious, of these 7 steps, which do you think are the easiest and which are the hardest?
Oh, I like this question. And can I start with the hardest?
Yes, please do.
Definitely the hardest is decoding someone's implicit mental moves. It's not even available to them. So unlike usual, when the expert is the smarty pants in the room and they can just rattle on about it, you're trying to get at their implicit knowledge, their tacit knowledge, and they can't describe it. And you know it's going well when they start getting hot under the collar and they're like, let me see, how do I do that? And so that's really hard, and but it really works with your noviceness. You can get people to explain, like I was starting to get Katie to explain her expertise. But the easiest is, I think, step 4, where this is about getting students to practice. This is what a lot of people think people at teaching centers do, what education is about. Thousands and thousands now of teaching methods. But what I say step 4 is about is, and what our book has a lot about, is that you want to take the mental action and match it to a teaching method. And certain teaching methods are better for the different kinds of mental actions. Like I like to call Bloom's typology. And at the lower level, we have remembering. And for analysis, that's taking, remembering is just like blunt remembering, like rehearsal of facts. And analysis is taking things apart. Synthesis is putting things together in a new way. And there are methods that are good for each of those. For example, if you just want somebody to blunt force remember some facts and terms, then the methods that you use, and this is very clear, is you use flashcards, mnemonics, quiz bowls, things like that, right? Those are the blunt force rehearsal methods. Now that you know that the mental move is just plain old remember. And if the type of thinking is application, this is where I'm going to talk about models in a second, where you have people solving equations, right? You give them new numbers into this equation, then you might use the worked out problem method, where you might have the equation all worked out, all the steps of it, and then you have to have the students practice writing in why was each step done. Or sometimes some of the steps are eventually not filled in and the students have to fill them in, so they practice applying this equation and have to solve the problem-solving method for this equation. Or maybe you're working in a field with models like sociology or education, and you give case studies. So here's a real situation, it's real messy. What happens when you apply our models and our theories to this situation? And case studies is the method for that. It's one of the methods. There's several. But anyway, once you know what kind of thinking you're doing, then it's really easy to choose the methods that are good for that kind of thinking. So there's an appendix in our book about that, and the chapter describes how to make that match. So that's the easy one, because you've already got the mental move out on the table. We can see what it is. what are the teaching methods that encourage that kind of thinking.
Okay, we've had a couple more questions come in. Someone says, from what you said earlier, it sounds like there is a literature on common threshold concepts and bottlenecks for a variety of fields. Can you confirm that?
Well, I just Google like threshold concepts in biology, threshold concepts in chemistry. Often they're in science fields, but there are some in literature. Every day people are writing, publishing more and more. I got 5 notifications yesterday that there were 5 things published about decoding the disciplines. One was in literature, one was in history. I forget what the rest of them were. But so you can Google bottlenecks in such and such and see what people have written about it. And threshold concepts, I mean, I just typically Google it.
All right. Someone else asked.
Something somebody could write me.
All right. Someone else says, it seems like there are lots of parallels or intersections with Bransford et al., the 1999 How People Learn Meta Study. I don't know if you're familiar with that, Joan, but they say, any thoughts on this?
Would you repeat the beginning of the question, please?
Yeah, and if you click on the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen as well, it'll pull up right in front of you if you want to read it.
Well, I think How People Learn was really looking deeply at the disciplines, right? He was looking really, what do historians really do? I don't think they were saying you could say that's a mental action and you can teach it this way and this way. I think they were really exploring how deeply the thinking in the disciplines is and comparing that. But it wasn't a theory of pedagogy, which is what we have. But I learned a lot from that book, how serious to take the disciplines, how deep the different kinds of disciplines work.
Okay. So I just have one final question, Joan, as we're wrapping up here. We're getting so close to the end of our hour. I'm wondering if you can talk about what you hope instructors will be able to do after reading this book.
Okay, we didn't get to the question on evidence that it works, but they can look in the book for that.
We didn't.
Okay?
Unfortunately, we ran out of time.
Okay. I hope that people will be able to think about teaching in a new way with the bottleneck viewpoint, the mental moves that they're trying to get students to learn instead of the content, using lots of assessments. And then when you learn to tackle an important bottleneck, it can increase student learning, just not on just that bottleneck, but on the whole enterprise of that particular discipline. So I like to tell the story that one of my favorite parts of the book, not a part we wrote, but Dan Bernstein told this story in the foreword. He says that intellectual skills are really honored in academia. In fact, people like to take pride in making analytic leaps, even leaving their colleagues behind. And students can buy into this game too. One time he taught a class, he really worked hard on it, psychology class, and his students, they all did the hardest task really well. So he was telling them, I worked on course design, and the top student in the class raised his hand and he said, that's not fair. I worked so hard to learn this on my own, and now you're just making it available to all the other students. And another student raised his hand, he said, it's about time people taught me so I could learn it. And he says that's what he likes about our method. This is not about lowering the bar to make it easier for students to learn. It's about keeping the bar high and bringing as many students up to the bar as we can.
All right, Joan, I want to thank you so much for sharing your knowledge today. And I want to thank everybody who attended today. This was so fun for this first webinar. I do want to remind everyone we have 2 other webinars coming up this spring. And if you've registered for this series, you're going to receive automated email reminders about these webinars. The next one is happening on April 20th, same time, same web link that you clicked on today. And this is for Linda Nilsson's book on creating engaging discussions. And then after that in May on the 18th, again, same time, same web link, we'll have Sandra McGuire talking about her new book, Teach Yourself How to Learn. So I hope you'll join us for both of these upcoming webinars. And I want to definitely give a digital round of applause, both to Joan and to everyone who joined us today. So thank you so much.
And I want to thank everybody for your great questions and for being here. Thanks so much. Great to see you all.
Thanks everyone for your engagement, and a replay will be available shortly. So if you want to pass this on to colleagues, we will make sure that you get an email letting you know when it's available. Thanks everybody.
Thanks. Great to see you.